June 19, 1944. The morning sky above the Philippine Sea shimmered with sunlight and silence. For a moment. Then, out of that silence, came a sound that every Japanese pilot had come to dread. The deep, throaty roar of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Iwamoto, a veteran Zero ace, banked hard to port. Below him, the ocean was a vast sheet of glass, glittering beneath the rising sun. He had seen this before. American carrier planes climbing from the east. But this time, something was different. They were bigger, faster, heavier. Their wings didn't flash silver like the fragile Wildcats of 1942. These were painted a dull, menacing blue-gray, like steel against the sea. The radio crackled. Hellcats inbound. Moments later, the sky erupted. Tracers sliced through clouds. A Zero spiraled into the waves, its thin frame shredded by 650 caliber guns. The dogfight lasted less than 3 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 5 Zeros were gone, and the American pilot had barely used half his ammunition. For the first time, Japanese aviators realized the unthinkable. The hunters of the Pacific were now the hunted. In the early years of the Pacific War, the sky belonged to Japan. From December 1941 to the summer of 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero ruled every battlefield it touched. Its arrival stunned Western observers, a lightweight, long-range fighter with unmatched agility and range. American and British pilots who faced it for the first time over Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, or the Philippines described it as if it were defying physics. Powered by a Nakajima Sakai radial engine, the Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and travel farther than any Allied aircraft. In those first months of war, U.S. Navy and Marine squadrons flying outdated F-4F Wildcats were shredded in combat. Dogfights that should have been even contests turned into massacres. At Rabaul, Coral Sea, and Midway, Japanese naval aviators demonstrated a mastery born from years of combat experience in China. Their tactics were refined, their coordination flawless, and their aircraft light, responsive, and unforgivingly lethal. To face a Zero head-on was often suicide. American pilots tried to adapt. They learned to dive away rather than turn. They called the Zero Zeke. But behind the nickname was fear, a respect for a machine that seemed almost supernatural. By mid-1942, however, that aura of invincibility began to fade. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 of its elite aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with many of its most experienced pilots. What Japan didn't lose in that battle was replaced with something worse. Time. Time for the United States to learn, to build, and to innovate. Grumman, a small but determined American aircraft manufacturer based on Long Island, had already seen enough. Their F-4F Wildcat had fought bravely, but was outmatched by the Zero's speed and maneuverability. Pilots reported they had to fire blind bursts or rely on sheer luck to survive. The company's engineers, led by Leroy Grumman himself, began sketching a successor, one that could finally take back the Pacific skies. At first, it wasn't clear what this new fighter would need to be. Some argued for lighter airframes to match the Zero's agility. Others demanded heavier armor and more firepower, insisting that survivability mattered more than speed. The U.S. Navy wanted both. An aircraft that could outfight the enemy and still come home. Grumman engineers started with lessons written in blood. The Wildcat's shortfalls, the Zero's strengths, and the pilot reports from early clashes. From this emerged the blueprint of what would become the F6F Hellcat, a machine that looked unremarkable, but carried the weight of every lost battle behind it. Still, in 1942, America was fighting for survival. Japan continued to dominate the air war across the Pacific, expanding from the Solomons to the Dutch East Indies. On nearly every island, Allied troops watched helplessly as Zeros swooped overhead, their engines screaming in victory. The psychological toll was immense, but beneath that chaos, the United States was preparing something monumental. Factories across the country began operating day and night. New aircraft carriers were being laid down in record time. The industrial base of an entire nation was awakening, and it was only a matter of months before it would meet Japan's finest technology head-on. The Zero's dominance was not eternal. It was built on precision craftsmanship, limited resources, and a small pool of elite aviators. Japan had built an empire on quality, not quantity. The United States, by contrast, was about to prove that quantity, backed by relentless innovation, could redefine what air superiority meant. And at the heart of that revolution, a new aircraft was about to take flight, one designed not just to match the Zero, but to erase its legend entirely. By late 1942, Grumman's experimental fighter stood ready for its first true tests, and it began with a captured Zero, a hidden hangar, and a challenge that would decide the future of the Pacific. In the summer of 1942, a curious aircraft arrived at the U.S. Navy's test base on San Diego's North Island. Its fuselage bore faded Japanese markings, its wings dented and scorched. American intelligence had recovered it from a crash site on Akutan Island, Alaska. A mostly intact A6M Zero, engineers and pilots studied it obsessively. For the first time, they could see their enemy up close. Every rivet, every control surface, every weakness. The aircraft was extraordinary, but it was also fragile. Its lightweight frame had been achieved through one crucial compromise: almost no armor. One good hit in the right place could tear it apart. When Grumman's engineers learned this, they knew what to do. The new fighter wouldn't just imitate the Zero, it would outlast it. Leroy Grumman and his chief engineer Bill Schwendler reworked the prototype F6F from nose to tail. They scrapped the original Wright Cyclone engine and replaced it with the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000-horsepower powerhouse that would define American fighters for the rest of the war. It was heavy, loud, and brutally strong, the opposite of the Zero's delicate precision. The cockpit sat high, giving pilots unmatched visibility during carrier landings. Thick armor plates surrounded the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks replaced the flammable bladders that had doomed so many wildcats. 650 caliber Browning machine guns lined the wings, each capable of spitting nearly 1,200 rounds per minute. It was not a racer. It was a weapon, built to take damage, strike hard, and bring its pilot home. In June 1942, test pilot Bob Hall climbed into the prototype XF6F-1. The aircraft lifted from the runway, steady and confident. Hall's report was simple: "She flies like a dream, and she climbs like a devil." The Navy, desperate for a counter to the Zero, ordered the design into full production before a single combat test had taken place. By early 1943, the first F6F-3 Hellcats began rolling off assembly lines in Bethpage, Long Island. Workers, many of them women, assembled the fighters in shifts around the clock. Each aircraft took less than 10,000 man-hours to produce, and Grumman developed an internal motto that defined the company's spirit: "Keep 'em flying." Training squadrons across the Pacific received their first Hellcats in February 1943. The pilots' first impressions were unanimous. It was big, it was tough, and it could take a beating like nothing before it. The Zero could still outturn it, but the Hellcat could dive faster, climb higher, and survive hits that would disintegrate any Japanese aircraft. When the Hellcat finally entered combat in August 1943 during raids against Marcus Island, the results were immediate. In their first major engagement, U.S. Navy pilots shot down nearly every attacking Zero with minimal losses. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the balance of the Pacific Air War began to tilt. The arrival of the Hellcat also signaled a transformation in American doctrine. The days of individual heroics and chaotic dogfights were over. The Navy introduced radar-assisted interception, combat air patrols, and coordinated squadron tactics. The Hellcat's radios and radar beacons allowed carrier fleets to fight as unified systems, turning the vast Pacific into a deadly trap for any Japanese formation that dared to enter. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to replenish what it had lost. The empire's training pipeline collapsed under the weight of mounting casualties. Its finest pilots were dead, and their replacements were rushed into combat after as little as 100 flight hours, barely half of what American trainees received. In the skies above the Solomons and the Gilberts, the difference began to show. Zeros still appeared, but they were no longer flown by masters. The Hellcat, in the hands of disciplined and well-trained Americans, began to dominate every encounter. The weapon that would go on to shoot down over 5,000 Japanese aircraft had been born in less than a year, and its time was only just beginning. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the Hellcat was no longer the underdog. It was the face of American air power. But to understand how it conquered the Pacific, we have to see it through different lenses: the machine, the men who flew it, and the enemies who faced it. From a distance, the F6F Hellcat didn't look revolutionary. Its broad wings and boxy frame seemed heavy, almost clumsy, a brute compared to the sleek Japanese Zero. But the secret of its dominance wasn't beauty, it was balance. Every bolt, panel, and engine mount was designed for one purpose: survival. Unlike the Zero, the Hellcat could absorb punishment and keep flying. It was built with the brutal honesty of American engineering, not to impress, but to endure. The heart of the aircraft, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was a masterpiece of power and reliability. Producing over 2,000 horsepower, it gave the Hellcat a top speed of nearly 380 miles per hour, faster than any Japanese fighter it faced. Its supercharger system allowed the aircraft to perform at altitudes where the Zero's engine gasped for air. And then there was the armor: thick steel plating around the cockpit, bullet-resistant glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks. It added weight, yes, but it saved lives. A Zero pilot who took a hit often never made it home. A Hellcat pilot, in many cases, did. This changed the psychology of air combat. American pilots could fight aggressively, knowing their machine would protect them. They could dive into the fight, trade blows, and come out alive. That confidence was as important as speed or firepower. Its .650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns unleashed over 7,000 rounds per minute, enough to shred even the toughest Japanese airframes. The Zero's thin skin and lack of armor turned each burst into an instant kill. In head-to-head combat, the Hellcat's guns didn't just outmatch, they overwhelmed, but power alone wasn't victory. The Hellcat's real weapon was what it gave the pilot: control. Its design offered forgiving handling, stable landings, and predictable stalls. A rookie could fly it safely, while an ace could push it to its limits. Grumman engineers often said the aircraft was built by pilots, for pilots. Many who returned from combat would later call it the best friend I ever had. When the Hellcat entered combat, the U.S. Navy had already learned a bitter lesson: never fight the Zero on its own terms. The early losses of 1942 had forced a complete rethink of aerial combat strategy. American pilots adopted a new doctrine: boom and zoom. Instead of turning in tight circles, a fight the Zero would always win, Hellcat pilots climbed high above their opponents, dove in for a single high-speed attack, and then zoomed back up before the lighter Japanese fighters could follow. It was a duel of physics, weight and momentum against finesse. The Zero could outturn anything, but it couldn't climb or dive like the Hellcat. This new tactic played to every advantage the Americans had. Engagements became fast, vertical, and deadly. Training schools in the United States drilled this philosophy relentlessly. "Don't turn with him," instructors repeated. "Hit hard, climb, and come again." The results were devastating. Radar, once an experimental tool, now became a core part of naval warfare. Hellcat squadrons used radar-directed interception, allowing them to strike enemy formations long before they reached the fleet. For the first time, night operations became viable. The F6F-5N, a night fighter variant equipped with radar, hunted bombers and reconnaissance planes under cover of darkness, something the Japanese never managed to match. Tactically, the Hellcat also changed how carriers fought. In earlier years, American carrier air wings were small and often scattered. With the introduction of the Hellcat, the Navy created massive combat air patrols, rotating squadrons that guarded the fleet in overlapping formations. This aerial shield made it nearly impossible for Japanese bombers to reach the carriers undetected. When combined with the Hellcat's endurance, nearly 1,000 miles of operational range, the result was a mobile fortress of air power. The Pacific, once dominated by Japanese patrols, became a killing ground for any Zero daring to cross into American airspace. The tactics and the technology were now perfectly aligned. The Hellcat was not the fastest fighter of the war, nor the most elegant, but it was the most effective. By 1944, it wasn't just a machine. It was a strategy in motion, a symbol of industrial precision and tactical intelligence combined. And as new squadrons joined the fight, those blue-gray wings would soon carry names that would echo through history. They came from farms, towns, and small cities. Young men who had never seen the ocean before they saw combat. Yet in the cockpit of the Hellcat, they became legends. And across the Pacific, their enemies, once the masters of the sky, began to feel the weight of that change. They were barely out of their 20s, some still teenagers, yet they carried the full weight of the Pacific War on their shoulders. The pilots of the F6F Hellcat were not superheroes. They were trained, tested, and terrified men who learned to trust their machine and each other. Among them was Ensign Alexander Vraciu, a lean, sharp-eyed pilot from Indiana. In less than 2 years, he would shoot down 19 Japanese aircraft and destroy 21 on the ground. In one mission during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, he downed 6 enemy planes in just 8 minutes. His secret wasn't raw talent. It was preparation. "You didn't fight the Zero," he once said. "You managed him. You stayed alive long enough to get the shot." Then there was Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, who earned the Medal of Honor for shooting down 34 enemy aircraft, including 9 in a single sortie. Calm, patient, and methodical, McCampbell became the symbol of the disciplined, calculating airmen the Navy had spent years training to produce. And Lieutenant Butch O'Hare, one of the first Hellcat heroes, set the tone early in the war. Flying alone over the Pacific, O'Hare once engaged 9 Japanese bombers heading for his carrier, shooting down 5 in minutes and saving the ship. His name would later be given to O'Hare International Airport, a tribute to a man who embodied courage under impossible odds. But for every ace who made the headlines, there were hundreds who never did. Young men who flew their sorties, scored no kills, and still faced death every day. The Hellcat gave them a fighting chance. Many would return home because of its thick armor or its rugged engine that refused to quit. The cockpit was their world. The smell of oil and metal, the hum of the engine, the thump of machine guns. Above the Pacific, time distorted. A minute felt like an hour, and when they returned to their carrier decks, their hands often trembled as the arresting hook slammed into the steel cable. They were alive. For today, that was enough. The Hellcat wasn't just a weapon. It was their partner in survival, a machine that could forgive mistakes in a war that did not. For the Japanese pilots, the world was changing, and fast. In 1941, they had been the masters of the sky, the elite of the Imperial Navy. Their training program was among the toughest in the world, producing men of extraordinary skill and discipline. Many had already fought in China before the war began. But by 1943, those veterans were gone, lost over Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons. Their replacements were younger, less experienced, and sent into. They were barely out of their 20s, calm faces behind oxygen masks, eyes fixed on the horizon. The Hellcat gave them a fighting chance, but victory still came down to the man in the cockpit. One of them was Ensign Alexander Vrasiu, a young pilot from Indiana who joined the Navy before Pearl Harbor. In June 1944, flying his F6F Hellcat from the carrier USS Lexington, he achieved something almost unimaginable. In just 8 minutes, he shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers. His gun camera footage became legend. Cool, efficient destruction against impossible odds. Then there was David McCampbell, the commander of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex, a calm, methodical leader. McCampbell's name would become synonymous with mastery in the Hellcat. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he single-handedly shot down 9 enemy planes in one mission, earning the Medal of Honor. By war's end, he had 34 aerial victories, all in the Hellcat. Stories like theirs captured headlines, but behind each ace was a team. Mechanics, deck crews, and armorers working in sweltering heat to keep the aircraft ready. Every sortie was the product of thousands of hands. The Hellcat was an industrial miracle, but it was also a human one. For the pilots, the Hellcat wasn't just a weapon, it was a companion. It forgave mistakes that would have killed them in lesser planes. It could limp home with holes in its fuselage the size of fists, oil leaking from the cowling, and still land safely on a pitching carrier deck. One pilot, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, famously said before his final mission, "If she can bring me back once, she'll bring me back again." He never returned from that flight, but his words spoke to what every Hellcat pilot believed, that the machine beneath them was built to protect its own. These men were not fearless. They were trained, hardened, and terrified in equal measure. But the Hellcat gave them what no American fighter had given before: confidence. And confidence wins battles long before the guns start firing. For the Japanese pilots who once dominated the Pacific, the arrival of the Hellcat was like watching the sun set on their empire. Early in the war, the Zero had been untouchable. Veteran aviators like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa amassed kill counts that made them national heroes. They fought with grace and precision, believing their aircraft and their training made them invincible. But by late 1943, the tone of their combat reports began to change. They spoke of new American planes that could dive forever, and thick-skinned beasts that refused to burn. The Hellcat shattered the myths that had sustained Japanese air power. In engagements over Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Truk Lagoon, entire Japanese formations vanished under Hellcat attacks. For every American pilot lost, Japan lost 10. The statistics told a brutal story. The F6F achieved a kill ratio of nearly 19-1, a number so extreme that even Japanese commanders struggled to believe it. But the truth ran deeper than hardware. Japan's air strategy was collapsing from within. Fuel shortages limited training hours. Factories could not replace aircraft fast enough, and the Empire's best pilots were gone. The men who took their place were brave but inexperienced, thrust into battle with minimal instruction. Facing radar-guided, well-coordinated American squadrons flying Hellcats, they never stood a chance. Former Zero ace Saburo Sakai one of the few to survive, later recalled his first encounter with the Hellcat in 1944. "It could climb faster than any machine I had seen," he wrote. "I attacked, but my bullets bounced like rain on a stone." He barely escaped alive. For Japan, the psychological blow was devastating. Once proud pilots, trained to believe in spiritual superiority and divine fate, now found themselves powerless. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese pride, had become a coffin with wings. By mid-1944, word spread through the Imperial Navy's ranks. Avoid the blue-gray fighters at all costs. But there was no avoiding them. The Pacific was now a vast ocean patrolled by Hellcats, hundreds at a time, launched from a dozen carriers. The empire that began the war with air supremacy now fought in fear. And as the months passed, the fear turned to desperation. Out of that desperation would come a new, tragic weapon, one that no amount of technology could fully prepare for. The skies were no longer a duel of equals. Japan's finest pilots had fallen, their replacements cut down before their names were known. And in 1944, all that remained was a single gamble. A massive strike meant to turn back the tide once and for all. It would be the largest carrier battle in history. June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The dawn broke soft and gold over the carriers of Task Force 58, the mightiest naval air armada the world had ever seen. 15 American carriers drifted across the Pacific like floating cities, their decks crowded with Hellcats, Avengers, and dive bombers, more than 900 aircraft waiting for launch orders. To the west, the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered its last major carrier fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. 9 carriers, 473 aircraft, and the desperate hope of turning back the American advance toward the Mariana Islands. The Marianas were Japan's shield. If they fell, American B-29 bombers could strike the home islands themselves. This would be their last stand. At 10 Charter a.m., American radar operators aboard the USS Lexington picked up faint signals. A vast formation approaching from 150 miles out. The call went out. Bogies inbound. In minutes, the air filled with the thunder of engines. Hellcats roared off the decks in perfect sequence, their wings folding open like the blades of a machine god. At the center of it all was Fighter Director Officer Lieutenant Colonel James Jig Dog Ramage, coordinating hundreds of interceptors through radar and radio. The Japanese force, nearly 370 aircraft, flew in staggered waves toward the American fleet, hoping to overwhelm defenses with sheer numbers. But this time, the Americans saw them coming. From 20,000 feet above the sea, the first wave of Hellcats spotted the enemy. Zeros escorting D-3A Val dive bombers and B-6N Jill torpedo planes. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, calmly gave the order. "Let's go get 'em!" The clash that followed would become one of the most one-sided aerial battles in history. As the formations closed, the sky turned into a storm of contrails and tracers. The Zero pilots, many of them barely trained teenagers, tried to break through the defensive wall. But the Hellcats met them head-on, diving from above with the sun behind them, just as they'd been trained. In the first 15 minutes, over 40 Japanese planes were shot down. Pilots described the scene as surreal, a rolling, endless ballet of death. The ocean below sparkled with wreckage and flame. American ships reported hundreds of splashes, each marking another downed attacker. Radio channels buzzed with voices. Splash 1 Zeke. Splash 3. I've got 5. Still counting. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, already an ace, spotted a formation of 6 dive bombers heading straight for the fleet. Diving from above, he lined up his sights and fired. One after another, the enemy planes erupted into flames. In 8 minutes, 6 kills. His ammunition counters clicked empty, just as the last bomber exploded in mid-air. By midday, the first wave of Japan's offensive was gone. Those who made it through faced the Hellcats again on the return trip. American carrier decks were untouched, but the Japanese commanders refused to stop. At 11:00 a.m., a second wave was launched, smaller, more desperate. American radar tracked them instantly. Fighters from the USS Bunker Hill intercepted the formation 60 miles out. Within minutes, 70 more enemy aircraft were destroyed. The pattern repeated again and again. Every wave ended the same way. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft scattered, burning or sinking beneath the waves. By evening, the results were catastrophic. Out of roughly 370 planes launched, Japan lost over 300. American losses? 23 Hellcats. The U.S. Navy pilots began to call it the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a grim, almost mocking nickname for what was essentially the death of Japan's naval air arm. The battle wasn't just won in the air, it was engineered, rehearsed, and executed with machine-like precision. American radar gave them the first strike. Hellcat tactics ensured they won every engagement. And Japan's once elite aviators were gone, replaced by men who never stood a chance. As the last Japanese squadrons fell from the sky, the airwaves went silent. Pilots returning to their carriers described the ocean below as glittering with wreckage, a sea of fire. But the day's slaughter wasn't over yet. Far to the west, Admiral Ozawa's carriers still floated, unaware that they were about to lose not just their aircraft, but the very heart of Japan's naval power. The Americans were coming for the carriers themselves. As the sun sank behind the Philippine Sea, the Hellcats refueled, rearmed, and prepared to strike again. The next morning would bring the second act of the battle, one that would seal Japan's fate in the skies forever. June 20th, 1944, the second day of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The morning broke quiet, too quiet. For hours, the Pacific stretched in eerie calm, waves rolling softly beneath the burning sky, wreckage still drifting from the day before. American pilots on the decks of Task Force 58 watched the horizon, waiting for the order that would decide the fate of Japan's carrier fleet. They didn't have to wait long. At 1540 hours, radar on the USS Enterprise picked up distant blips, faint echoes of ships nearly 300 miles away. The enemy was retreating west, toward the safety of Okinawa. But Admiral Mark Mitchell, commander of the U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force, made a daring decision. He ordered a maximum range strike. It was a gamble. The Japanese fleet was far beyond safe operational distance. If the pilots couldn't find their way back before nightfall, hundreds might be lost to fuel exhaustion or the dark Pacific waters. But the chance to annihilate Japan's carrier force was too great to pass up. At 16:20, the order came, launch all fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes capable of flight. The carriers exploded into motion. From Lexington, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, and others, 240 aircraft roared into the sky, forming a massive strike wave stretching across the horizon. Avengers carried torpedoes slung beneath their bellies. Helldivers loaded with 1,000-pound bombs. Hellcats circled overhead, protecting the formation like steel-winged hawks. The pilots knew the risk. They were flying deep into enemy waters, chasing targets that might already be out of range. But they also knew what was at stake: the end of Japan's naval air power, once and for all. At 18:30, after 2 hours of flight, the ocean below shimmered with faint glints. Ships, the Japanese carrier fleet. There they were: Taiho, Zuikaku, Shokaku, and several light carriers, all fleeing westward in loose formation. The Americans dove in. The attack unfolded like a symphony of destruction. Dive bombers from the USS Belleau Wood screamed down almost vertically from 20,000 feet. Torpedo planes skimmed the waves, weaving through anti-aircraft fire that turned the sea into a forest of flame and smoke. The Zuikaku, one of the last survivors of Pearl Harbor, was the first to be hit. Bombs tore through her flight deck, setting off massive secondary explosions. Smoke billowed thousands of feet into the air. Moments later, Hiyo took a direct torpedo hit near her starboard engine room. Flames burst from her hull. Within minutes, the carrier was dead in the water. Then came Junyo, Chiyoda, Chitose, each battered, burning, or sinking under relentless attack. In less than an hour, 4 Japanese carriers were out of action. Hundreds of sailors were trapped below decks. Pilots who managed to take off found nowhere to land upon return. The once proud mobile fleet, the jewel of Japan's navy, was now a graveyard. As night fell, the American pilots faced a new enemy: the darkness. Their fuel gauges were nearly empty. The carriers they'd left behind were hundreds of miles to the east, invisible in the Black Sea. Many would never make it back, but Admiral Mitcher made a decision few commanders would dare. At 20:45, he gave the order to turn on every light on every ship: flight decks, signal lamps, even searchlights. It was a beacon across the Pacific, a glowing lifeline for the men returning from hell. From the darkness, pilots spotted the glow and wept with relief. Dozens crash-landed, ditching into the sea beside their carriers, where destroyers rushed to pull them from the waves. Others came in hard, skidding across the decks with empty tanks. By midnight, more than 80 aircraft were lost to fuel exhaustion. But most of their pilots were saved. And more importantly, the Japanese fleet had been broken. When dawn rose over the Philippine Sea on June 21st, the wreckage of Japan's carrier armada drifted quietly across the ocean. Of the 9 carriers that had set out days before, 3 were sunk, 4 crippled, and 2 barely afloat. Over 600 aircraft had been destroyed in 2 days, the majority of Japan's remaining naval aviation. One American pilot described it simply: "They threw their air force at us, and we shot it out of the sky." The Imperial Navy would never again launch a major carrier offensive. The battle marked the death of Japan's naval aviation, a blow from which it would never recover. From that moment onward, the skies of the Pacific belonged entirely to the United States. And the path to Japan's home islands, to Saipan, Guam, Tinian, and eventually Hiroshima, lay wide open. June 22, 1944. Just 3 days after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the sea around the Mariana Islands was still thick with oil slicks and drifting debris. Overhead, the same F6F Hellcats that had obliterated Japan's Air Force now circled the volcanic shores of Saipan, the next target in America's Pacific advance. The island was small, barely 15 miles long, but it held enormous strategic weight. From Saipan, B-29 superfortresses could reach the Japanese home islands for the first time. For Tokyo, it meant the war's front line was now within range of its own skies. The invasion had begun days earlier. On June 15th, 75,000 U.S. Marines and Army troops, under Lieutenant General Holland, howlin' mad, Smith stormed ashore against an entrenched Japanese force of over 30,000 men commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. The beaches were a nightmare. Mortar fire rained down as landing craft rammed into coral reefs. Marines waded through waist-deep surf, dragging wounded comrades to shore. The air reeked of diesel, cordite, and salt. Offshore, the thunder of naval guns pounded the island's ridges, sending columns of smoke and dust into the humid air. For the first week, progress was slow. Every ridge, every cave, every patch of jungle was defended to the death. But behind the front lines, The Japanese soldiers were already beginning to realize what had happened at sea. There would be no reinforcements, no air cover, no carriers coming to save them. Saipan had become an island of the damned. By the end of June, American tanks rolled through the center of the island. Hellcats patrolled overhead, strafing Japanese positions that tried to regroup. The sound of the R-2800 engines became constant. The same sound that had haunted Japanese pilots days earlier now echoed over their last ground stronghold. General Saito, realizing defeat was inevitable, issued one final order. You are to die an honorable death. Each man will kill 10 of the enemy, then die. On July 7th, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War erupted. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, many wounded and unarmed, charged screaming into the American lines at dawn, carrying swords, bayonets, even sticks. They tore through 2 U.S. battalions before being mowed down by machine gun fire and artillery. The fields of Saipan turned red. By July 9th, the island was declared secure. But the cost was staggering. Over 3,400 Americans dead, 10,000 wounded. For Japan, nearly 30,000 soldiers and civilians were killed, many by suicide, leaping from cliffs at Marpi Point rather than face capture. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves through the Japanese high command. For the first time, Japan's inner defensive perimeter had been breached. Emperor Hirohito reportedly wept when he heard the news. Days later, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the man who had led Japan into war, resigned in disgrace. For the pilots who had fought over the Philippine Sea, Saipan marked something deeper than victory. It was the proof that their new aircraft, the Hellcat, had turned the tide of the Pacific. In less than a year, the U.S. Navy had gone from desperation to dominance. The F-6F had destroyed more than 5,000 Japanese planes, crippled an empire's confidence, and given the Allies control of the skies. But even as the stars and stripes rose over Saipan, the men who fought there knew. This was not the end. The next battles would be bloodier still. As Saipan burned behind them, American carriers turned north, preparing for the next step. The capture of Guam, Tinian, and, eventually, the push toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But for Japan's navy, broken and blind, there was only silence left. Would you like me to continue with Aftermath, Section 2, the numbers, the shift in strategy, and the human toll? By the end of the summer of 1944, the Pacific had changed forever. The Japanese Empire, once the master of the seas, now found itself shattered, blind, and grounded. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had wiped out not just aircraft and carriers, but something far more irreplaceable: its veteran pilots. Before the battle, Japan had already suffered heavy losses at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons, but it had always managed to scrape together new squadrons. By June 1944, however, its best men were gone, replaced by barely trained recruits rushed into the cockpits of Zeros that no longer matched the enemy's technology. When the F6F Hellcat entered combat, it brought something the Japanese couldn't match: a balance of speed, armor, and raw firepower. With 650 caliber Browning machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a rugged airframe that could take hits and keep flying, it turned aerial duels into slaughter. In the 2 days of the Philippine Sea, Hellcats shot down 375 Japanese planes, most of them Zeros. Across the entire war, their tally would climb to over 5,200 enemy aircraft destroyed, making the F-6F the most lethal naval fighter of World War II. To the Japanese, the numbers were incomprehensible. One Hellcat ace, David McCampbell, downed 9 enemy planes in a single sortie. An entire squadron erased in minutes. To a culture that once revered its fighter pilots as samurai of the sky, it was a national humiliation. But the numbers told a deeper story, one of production, training, and endurance. The United States had produced over 12,000 Hellcats by 1945. Japan, crippled by resource shortages and bombing raids, could barely produce a fraction of that. American pilots flew hundreds of training hours before seeing combat. Japanese pilots, sometimes less than 50. For every Zero that took off in 1944, there was a Hellcat waiting for it. Newer, faster, better armed, and flown by men who had been trained not to die gloriously, but to win. On the ground, the effects were just as devastating. The loss of air cover left Japanese garrisons stranded across the Pacific, cut off from supplies and hope. Islands like Saipan, Guam, and Tinian became isolated fortresses where soldiers starved rather than surrender. In Tokyo, military planners began to face the impossible. Without naval aviation, Japan's empire could no longer defend its vast ocean frontier. The remaining carriers, now little more than floating airstrips, were reserved for a desperate final act. Operation Shogo, the defense of the Philippines. It was there, months later at Leyte Gulf, that Japan's navy would make its final stand and be annihilated once and for all. But even before Leyte, the psychological damage was irreversible. The once proud Japanese pilot corps, trained in honor and precision, now lived under a shadow. The same skies they once ruled had become hostile territory. Many began to whisper of a new kind of attack, one born from desperation and nationalism rather than tactics. The seeds of the kamikaze had been planted. By early 1945, the Hellcat's silhouette had become a symbol of inevitability. Wherever it appeared, it meant Japan's resistance was nearing its end. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of equals. It was a one-sided storm. For the men who built and flew the Hellcat, it wasn't pride they felt. It was exhaustion. Many remembered the young Japanese pilots they shot down, men barely 20, flying outdated machines into hopeless odds. It was, in the words of one pilot, a massacre, not a battle. Yet, through that storm of steel and fire, the war edged toward its final act. The Hellcat had not just won dogfights, it had won air supremacy. And with that, it had opened the path to the bombers, and to the end of the war itself. As the skies fell silent and the wreckage drifted across the Pacific, the world began to reckon with what had just happened. The war in the air had changed forever, and with it, the very nature of victory. In the end, it wasn't just the bullets or bombs that decided the Pacific War. It was evolution. The evolution of machines, the evolution of training, the evolution of will. The F6F Hellcat wasn't the fastest fighter of World War II. It wasn't the sleekest or the most glamorous. But it was the right aircraft at the right time in the hands of men who refused to lose. Built in less than a year, tested in fewer months than most aircraft took to design, it became the unstoppable answer to Japan's early dominance. The same Pacific that had once echoed with the graceful arcs of Zeros now roared with the deep thunder of Hellcats. A sound that meant safety for Allied sailors and death for their enemies. Its kill record, more than 5,200 Japanese aircraft destroyed, was not just a statistic. It was a measure of transformation, of an empire's rise and its fall, of lessons learned in blood from Midway, Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal. By 1945, the Hellcat had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of industrial might, adaptation, and resolve. Every rivet, every cylinder of its massive radial engine represented what Japan could no longer match: a nation's total commitment to war production, training, and technological innovation. Yet behind every victory was a human face. Young men, some barely out of school, flying for hours over an endless ocean, each knowing that one mistake, one mechanical failure, could end their story in the waves below. When the war ended, the Hellcats were retired quietly. Many were scrapped, some sold, a few preserved in museums. But the pilots never forgot the sound of that engine, the weight of its guns, or the sight of the Pacific burning below them. And for the Japanese survivors who saw those blue-gray wings appear from the clouds, the memory lingered too. Not as hatred, but as a haunting symbol of how far the war had turned. In the story of the Pacific, the F6F Hellcat was not merely a weapon. It was the messenger of a new age in aerial warfare, and the sound of an empire falling from the sky.